Good morning, everybody. So, for those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Chris Minson, I'm a professor here at the Department of Human Physiology. And it is my great pleasure, and even greater honor, to introduce our University of Oregon Distinguished Alumni Speaker, Dr. Brad Wilkins. And so, Dr. Wilkins and I have known each other since the year 2000. I first met him when I was applying for a job here. I came out to interview, and I met a few of the grad students who were just starting in the program. He was actually starting to work with Dr. Gary Klug, who was our department head at the time. And in the first meetings I had, I thought, if I get this job, I want that guy as a grad student. So luckily I got offered the job, and then as soon as I had that word, I surreptitiously worked to steal the best grad student from the department. It's never a smart thing to do as an assistant professor, but it did work out for me, and I was able to bring Brad in. At the time, I also was able to bring in, I also have a woman named Lacey Alexander start with me, and then also a guy named Brett Wong to start with me as well. I refer to that group now as my A team, not because they're just the first group that came through, but they really set the standard for what I really want to see as far as grad students. Not just because they're all really bright, creative people, but because of how well they work together. They really support each other in every aspect of doing their graduate work together. They were super supportive of the department. You know, the class thing is someone says, when I say jump, you say how high. Well, they didn't say how high. They just jumped as high as they could, and they did a great job every single time. So I don't want to go too much into Brad's background because it's integrated into his what he's going to talk about today. But I'll give a couple of quick highlights. One is he's a Northern California boy by birth, graduating from Wairika High School. He then went to a small school not well known in Corvallis, Oregon, something or another. There for undergraduate. He then went to University of Northern Michigan for his master's, and then came here for his PhD. And then was at Mayo Clinic working with Mike Joyner, so you'll kind of see how probably some of Mike Joyner's influence has affected Brad. Mike is one of the preeminent exercise physiologists, performance physiologists in the world. He then took a little bit of a career direction change and went to work with Nike, and was in the thermal division there and ran that, and had a shift. I'll let him talk about that a little bit. But if you haven't heard about Brad, you should really look up, and you'll probably want to do it after this anyway. Breaking 2. So Brad was the key point person on the attempt by Nike and many other physiologists around the country and around the world to try and break the 2-hour marathon. So it's on Netflix. It's an incredible show, and Brad was the key person in that. So I could tell lots more stories about Brad, but I think I better turn it over. And again, it's my great honor to have you here, Brad, and we're all really proud of you. Thank you.
Everybody hear me okay? So I don't have to yell on this thing. Thank you, Chris. That was very nice. I'd also like to thank John for inviting me to be here. It's a great privilege and an honor to be speaking in this distinguished alumni. It kind of sounds weird to even consider myself a distinguished alumni for the University of Oregon Graduate School. But the University of Oregon has always been really good to me, especially the Department of Human Physiology. It's always been very supportive. Technical issues? Yeah. Is it on? Is there a lot of one?
No, it's a mess. Try to get you out.
So, yeah, generally, great honor to be here. The department and the graduate school has always been very good to me. We'll get things figured out. So I was giving one of these talks a while ago, about a year ago or so, and I had a student, a young scientist, come up to me after the talk and say, "I want your job." And okay, well, I just left Nike and I'm currently unemployed, so you might want to aim just a little bit higher. I have a friend that calls it self-unemployed, and so I often find it difficult to give people career advice. It's not that I don't want to help people out. I genuinely like to help people out. It's just I honestly have no idea how to tell somebody how to engineer a career, or engineer a path to do what I do, or what I've been lucky enough to be able to do in my job. So just to look at it kind of from a job position perspective, I was lucky enough to parlay a love of sport, a love of sports science into graduate school and a PhD at the University of Oregon, Human Physiology Department. And then a scientist career, research scientist career, which included Mayo Clinic. Chris mentioned I worked with Mike Joyner at the Mayo Clinic. Did a lot of great work there. I then broke most people's expectations by taking a job at Nike. I took a research position at Nike in the Nike Sport Research Lab, which is a very well-known industry sports science lab. While I was at Nike, I held several scientific and leadership positions. I founded a laboratory called the Nike Plus Sport Performance Laboratory. I also held a director position for the next generation research team within advanced research and development at Nike. During that time, I was lucky enough to lead the science team for Nike's attempt at the 2-hour marathon. And since its inception, since the beginning of the sport product management program, I've been instructing and teaching there at for a course called Human Performance and Sport Products in the Wilkins College of Business Sport Product Management program in Portland. In October of 2017, like I said, I left Nike and went out on my own venture. It's called West 124 Degrees. I help companies look at, kind of translate legitimate science, and that term legitimate science is going to become important, into their products as well as continue to help push boundaries in human performance. So this is what people who come to me and say, I want your job, this is what they see. They see the job positions. They see the trajectory of what my path was. But to say that I had a plan for this would be giving me way too much credit, and giving me way too much foresight in my thinking to be able to have this kind of plan. I did not have this kind of plan. So what I'm here today to try to convince you of is to not let your job get in the way of your work. So think about your job position very differently than you think about your work and how you impact the world with your work. I want to talk to you about creating a body of work. Creating a body of work that can impact the world and how you can do that. So it's not just about how do I get this job or how do I get that job. It's about how do I think about my body of work and how that fits together. There's some good news and there's some bad news about how we can create a body of work. The bad news is that there is no blueprint, there's no template, there's nothing out there for you to go and get, go do this, then go do that, then go do this, to create a body of work. I wrote an article, co-authored an article in the Physiologist, I guess it was 2012 or so, where we reviewed a book called Alternative Careers in Science. And it was a very good book, but one of the outcomes that I learned in writing that piece was that no two scientists, especially outside of academia, no two scientists approach or think about their career and the application of their science the same way. They all did it very, very differently. Okay, so there is no blueprint for creating a body of work. The great news, the amazing news, is that there is no blueprint for creating your body of work and the impact that your work can have on this world. I wake up every morning with equal parts fear and excitement about this fact that I can take my career in any direction I want. I obviously cannot be a professional basketball player, but I could work in professional basketball. So I can take my career in any direction I want. Sometimes that can be a little overwhelming. And that's why we often look for these blueprints or plans, but I'm here to tell you that it's just not there. What I actually do every day is defined by my purpose. My purpose of what I want my work to mean to the world. Okay? So I'm going to talk to you about these two things because I think these two things are the only two things that are necessary in creating an impactful body of work, and that's purpose and platform. Okay? Purpose is a sense that what we do produces something transcendent and serves meaning that's beyond ourselves. So it means something that's beyond just for us. Okay? There's three things that you can look for, three things that you can think about while you're creating your purpose, the purpose for your work. The first is passion. What are you passionate about? People say that passion is what are you willing to suffer for or devote your life or your work to. So think about that. What are you passionate about? The second thing is trying to find a common thread in your work that you can connect all the pieces together. A guy by the name of Todd Henry wrote a book called Die Empty, something about die empty, release your best work every day, or unleash your best work every day. And he calls this the through line. So what is that through line in your work that connects everything together that you can step back and say, all right, that represents a body of work. And finally, what makes you frustrated? What really pisses you off about your area that you can kind of attach to and say, I want to change that? For me, it's false science. It's science that is extrapolated beyond really what it means, and that is prolific in the sport product industry, as you all probably can recognize. There's a lot of false science. There's a lot of science that's been extrapolated beyond what it was intended to do in the first place, and it's put out there as truth and fact, and that pisses me off. And so part of my passion is really trying to change that and trying to be in a position where I can. As far as platform goes, platform can be a position that you hold, but more importantly, it's resources and infrastructure. Okay, what resources do you have available for you or to you? What infrastructure can you build or is available to you to allow you to do your work? So it's the proverbial, it's the place, but it's more than just a place. It's also resources and infrastructure. So, for example, at the University of Oregon, Wilkins College of Business, I have a platform there where I have resources available to me to help educate students, and I can use those resources to do the best work that I can in that place. Today, really, there's no excuse for not having a platform. And with social media and all the resources and infrastructure that's been built that are open to the public, there's no excuse for us not to have a platform. People do amazing things on Twitter as their platform. They use the resources and infrastructure that Twitter has available, and they can present their work on that platform. They don't need a job. So, I mean, ask the Kardashians. They've done a pretty great job of using that platform. I really don't know what their purpose is, but they have a great platform that they use extremely effectively. So there really is no excuse now to not have a platform available. My purpose is to push the boundaries of our potential, both collective and individual potential, through the exploration of human limits. This is what I wake up to every morning, or what I think about every morning when I wake up, and it guides my work. I think about scientific integrity as the number one thing that guides that work, or guides this purpose. An insatiable curiosity, a dedication to education, and a creative way that I look at every problem that I need to solve, so creative problem solving. So it's through these tenets and this purpose that I direct the work that I do with clients that I have, or with other work that I'm partaking in. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of some examples of my body of work in contrast to the positions or the jobs that I've had. I'm going to take you back through that time from the perspective of more of a body of work, so that we can kind of see the difference between what does work really mean and what is the difference between that and a job. What does that really mean? Hopefully, that's the idea anyway. So the first part is kind of what I call the discovery phase of my body of work. I learned early on that I have an insatiable curiosity. I love to discover new knowledge and explore new knowledge. So and I learned that here. I learned that at Mayo. I learned that learning things and discovering things that very few people in the world are even looking for was really, really cool. And I had a love for that. I gained a love for that. I learned a love for that. So this work included some of the things that we did here. It's a pretty cool body of work around extending knowledge, extending understanding, the mechanisms related to skin-blood flow when humans are exposed to heat stress. So we did a number of papers both here, and I did a little bit of Mayo and extended that work. And looking back through it, it's a really cool story of how we discovered things that, again, very, very few people at the time were even looking for. that's an example of what I'm talking about there, just the act of discovery. As a scientist, one of my favorite things, or one of the things that I love, is when you stay up all night crunching data, and that first graph that you make once you've gone through all that data, and you get to that point that's like, this is what we learned. That discovery became very, very important to me. Another set of studies that I'm very proud of is we use some very creative techniques and some creative ways to go and answer big questions. And in this case, these examples are related to understanding muscle blood flow and how that's related during hypoxic exercise, the combination of hypoxia and exercise. And again, just kind of the creativity, both in the studies we did with skin blood flow, as well as these studies that we did with understanding muscle blood flow, just kind of the creativity that we were able to approach those questions. I learned a lot from being able to do that. There's a few other examples. We did a lot of blood pressure regulation studies when I was at Mayo. Again, just kind of going after things, some pharmacological methods to studying how blood pressure is regulated that nobody else was doing. And so just the whole idea of becoming an explorer and learning how to discover brand new knowledge, that was a very important time in my life. So, and a very important time in developing this body of work. So I learned to be an explorer. I learned to be creative. I learned to have this love of discovery and the new knowledge that I was getting by doing these types of studies. As far as platform goes, I was lucky to have positions and work in a place where I had tremendous resources, tremendous infrastructure that was there to help me do this work. Sometimes it can be a little slow, but that infrastructure is there to really help in an academic setting such as this, to really help you and provide that infrastructure that allows you to be creative and do this exploratory type of work. Okay, so another thing that I learned was the grant process, learning how to convince people that my work is good, that our ideas are good, and get funding to be able to do those ideas. That's a very important part of the infrastructure that is available in an academic setting. Is you have to learn how to tell good stories. You have to learn how to connect your work to value that people are going to say, that's valuable, and I want to give you resources to be able to do that. So I learned that process, and I was successful in that process throughout my academic career, short-lived as it was, and I was able to get those resources and that infrastructure to be able to do some of the good work. The next phase is really what I call translation and application. Excuse me. So this phase of my work really started when I started at Nike. We did a lot of work on understanding interventions. That's the way I like to look at it. We're understanding interventions, how they impacted human physiology, how they impacted biomechanics. I'm a physiologist, so I wasn't doing a lot of biomechanics work, but that's the type of work that was done in our lab. From a platform standpoint, we had a tremendous amount of resources available to us. We were able to work very quickly. We were able to move things pretty fast through the lab and learn a lot very fast. And that infrastructure was in place for us to be able to do that. I also learned to apply some of the things that I learned in academic science, and that is how to convince people that my work is important, and how to convince people that we should be doing the types of work that I wanted to do, because I thought it was valuable both for the company and more importantly for people who were trying to perform at their peak, at their best. Okay, so I learned to treat Nike as my NIH. I learned to treat the people that were giving me money at Nike as my funding agency. I learned how to convince them that doing this type of work and looking at it this way is going to add just as much, if not more value than just testing the next thing that some designer thinks is going to work, right? So I was pretty successful in that in my career early on at Nike in convincing people that the type of work that we really wanted to do, these bigger questions that could have some really significant impact on both the company and, like I said, more importantly, the people that were using these interventions or products, and had a lot of value. And we were successful at at convincing Nike that this work had value. Specifically, just a couple of examples. Like I said, we explored a lot of interventions and how they impacted physiology. In this example, we were looking at how different interventions might impact accumulation of water vapor pressure in a layering system. So if you try to increase the gradient of water vapor pressure from the skin surface to the environment as much as possible, you can lose more heat via evaporation. And in this case, we showed that we did evaporate more sweat from the system with this second intervention, therefore hopefully losing more heat with this and allowing people to thermoregulate more optimally and more effectively. And so we looked at it that way. We also looked at it in the fact of how can I optimize this intervention? How can I optimize this thing that we're trying to build so that it impacts physiology optimally? So this is just an example of how we thought about it. We also were able to kind of take advantage of what we know about physiology to engineer and build interventions that could impact physiology. And so taking advantage of what we know and building things to try to mitigate if that's a problem or accentuate if it's something that we think is going to really impact performance. This is an example of a patent that we have. It's looking at a compressive therapeutic device that works when you're walking. It compresses, it acts like a muscle pump. That's the idea, the theory. External muscle pump, so that it can decrease the pooling of blood in the lower extremity. That's the idea. These things, we have a patent. It turns out these things are really hard to build. And they obviously never hit the market, but we still have this patent. But definitely hard to build, hard to get to work optimally every time. We have some good data that shows that it works. But definitely once you get down the line in a business where you have to make a lot of them for very small margins, or very big margins, small costs, something that never really hit the market, obviously. But it's a good example of how we thought about things. We thought about how do we engineer things to take advantage of what we know about physiology, or the work that we were doing from a scientific standpoint, all the things that we were learning. How do we build things? How do we engineer solutions in a creative way? So this is a good example of how we thought about it. I also had the opportunity to work with a lot of athletes during my time at Nike. This is an example of athletes that were doing some altitude training, both going to altitude and training in places like Park City or Mammoth, but also living high and training low. So living in a hypoxic tent and training in Portland, which is essentially sea levels. So we were tracking their total hemoglobin adaptations to their altitude training and their hypoxic living. And so, potentially if you have an increase in hemoglobin, that could increase your VO2 max and help your performance. This is an example of a couple of subjects. One that had a very good response when they went and trained at altitude, and the other that didn't really have a response. And you see this across the board in this type of research. One thing I would like to point out for those of you interested is look where this person started relative to where this person started, where this person ended. So this whole idea of how much you change could very well be related to where you start. And we saw that across the board as far as how much adaptation you get when you train at altitude or live at altitude. So that's just another example of the type of work that is translating and applying the science that we know or the science that we're doing at the time to either product innovations, interventions, or helping athletes. Kind of the next phase that I want to take you through is really more about science and innovation. So looking at science, how do we integrate and use science in business to have novel approaches to things, novel approaches to strategies, create novel approaches to products, create novel approaches to how the business even operates or how the organization even operates. I kind of became a student of innovation and tried to learn as much as I could about how business thinks about new ways to implement strategy, new ways to implement products. How many of you have been to the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry? Anybody? A couple people? You should go next time you're in Chicago. It's one of the best museums of science and industry that I've ever seen. My wife literally had to drag me out of the place because I was like elbowing kids out of the way at the waiting room. But it's an amazing place. And when you walk in, This is inscribed on the rotunda right when you walk in the door. And it says, obviously you can read it, but it says, "Science discerns the laws of nature, industry applies them to the needs of man." This became, I became connected to this statement because I started thinking, all right, how do I play where that dot is? How am I the person that's connecting the laws of nature that we learn from science to how industry is going to apply that to the needs of man? This became kind of my mantra in a place like industry, where I was a scientist that cared very much about scientific integrity, and how do I translate that, and how do I get other people to listen to how important it is to have good science in the work that they do. So this became an important statement in how I thought about things. Innovation is just really a fancy word for something new or novel, but it's thrown around in business all the time. It's now synonymous with just new products, like your iPhone was an innovation, right? When it first came out. So, but really what innovation is all about is about identifying and understanding the problems that need to be solved. That's at the core of what a product innovation or a business strategy innovation is. It's what is a problem, identifying that problem, and figuring out the best way to solve that problem for people or for organizations. So I really, again, like I said, became a student of this process and a student of how I could impact this process with science and coming up with real solutions that had a lot of scientific integrity. So this became a very important part of my career, especially at Nike. As I started to get more and more leadership type of positions, I tried to really change the way that the company was thinking, that the advanced research and development organization within Nike was thinking. How do you think about science? How do you think about business strategy? How do you set up an organization that allows science to play an integral role in that organization? How do we change the way we think about exploration and discovery? How do we leverage the diverse community that a place like Nike has, especially within their innovation organization? How do you think about everyday problems or the curiosity of your employees at your organization or the people that belong to your organization? What are those benefits? Are those benefits knowledge per se, or can we engineer those benefits into something that's going to help an athlete or help a human be better? Those are the kinds of things that I really started integrating into the way that I was thinking about my science and connecting that to the business. This is how I approach the class that I teach at the Sport Product Management program. I not only try to teach these students scientific insights that they are going to then take and use in their career, but I try to teach them about how do you translate those scientific insights, how do you apply those scientific insights in an organization that you're going to go and work for, in a business environment where you have to think about the rest of the way that that organization operates. And you have to think about the strategy and how that product or that knowledge that you now have can play a big role in that organization and in your career. So I try to really approach this class from that perspective, not just here's the science of human physiology or the science of human performance, but how do you take that and create something and do something meaningful within your career. So we also did a lot of work at Nike at predicting human performance or predicting human potential. When I started or founded the Nike Plus Sport Performance Laboratory, that was in the Nike Plus organization, so they were making all the digital electronics at the time. Nike is now theoretically out of that business, the wearable sensor business. But we were deep into it at the time. And so that's where we started really looking at, okay, how do we describe and predict human performance using mathematical models? I was always very interested in models, especially mathematical models that predict human systems. To predict human systems, how they behave, how they operate, how they what are the outcomes, how can we maybe predict the future using these models? But I was terrible at math, and so I couldn't do the math. So one of the things that is important from a platform standpoint is I created a situation where I was able to go hire and work with people who could do the math. And that's an important lesson that I learned along the way was if you have great ideas, but you don't know how to do a component of it, don't think, oh, I can't do that idea because I don't know how to do that. Find somebody that does. Collaborate with those people and don't let that hold you back from getting your idea out there. So from a platform perspective, that's what I did. I was able to hire people and work with algorithm engineers and data scientists and people who really knew the ins and outs of creating mathematical models in complex systems, like a human system. And we did a pretty good job of developing these models, and some of these models translated into product. The Nike Fuel Band, our math and science went into the second version of the Nike Fuel Band. It went into some of the sport watches that Nike made. And we also had a couple more products after that our science went into that never saw the light of day, which is unfortunate because they would have been awesome. But one of the things, just an example of some of that science, is we really dove into using the critical power model to describe performance. Is anybody familiar with the critical power model? A few people? Okay, the critical power model basically says critical power is an exercise intensity or a power or an energy expenditure that is the highest sustainable rate of work without appreciable fatigue for about 40 to 60 minutes. Once you're beyond 60 minutes, the models kind of fall apart. But this idea of critical power is that you can sustain this level for quite a long time without really fatiguing. Work above this critical power, or this critical threshold of exercise intensity, leads to or starts to cause fatigue, and this is highly predictable. So this W prime value is basically a capacity limited value that's above your critical power. Critical power is a rate limited value. But as you deplete that capacity in W prime, how you fatigue becomes extremely predictable. So this enables you to predict the best possible race times, for example, in a marathon. It allows you to predict the best possible race time. It also allows you to predict time to fatigue for individuals who are exercising at any point above critical intensity or critical power. Again, for those of you interested, so if you look at the oxygen uptake kinetics described by the critical power, you'll see steady state oxygen uptake kinetics at anything below critical power. And again, that can be sustained for a very, very long period of time. Well, about 60 minutes. But as soon as you go, which I think is a long time to do any endurance exercise, but as soon as you go above critical power, you start depleting that capacity limited W prime, and your VO2 will go to max. The rate at which it'll go to max, and you'll stop fatiguing once you'll be fatiguing, you'll stop exercising once you go to max. The rate at which it goes to max depends on how far above your critical power is. So if a person is just above their critical power, you'll have a slow rise to VO2 max, but you still will, and you'll once you hit max, you will voluntarily either have to stop or you'll have to slow way down to well below your critical power. So that's kind of some basic background, real quick. Sorry for jumping through that real fast, but some basic background on this model. So we really dove into how to understand this model and how to extend it and how to apply it in interventions. Okay? We also published some recent papers. These are actually very recent, from the last year, where we looked at identifying a new method to study or measure critical power in a non-endurance type of activity, so in intermittent sports. So things like basketball, soccer, we were able to identify and create a method to be able to delineate or measure critical power. One thing I didn't mention on the last slide is if you're above critical power and you're measuring blood lactate values, those will go to max as well. You'll see steady state blood lactate values below critical power, but above that they go to max and you fatigue. So that's demonstrated in our new technique, is when they were above critical power in the open triangles, they went to max. And their precipitous rise in blood lactates, and they stopped exercising. We're below, they sustained steady state blood lactates. Another paper that we published with some colleagues at the University of Exeter, Andy Jones's lab, we looked at how critical power changes over time. So we had people exercise at a heavy intensity domain, so a pretty hard exercise on a bike for 2 hours, and then we had them do a critical power test at the end of that 2 hours. I'm very glad that I wasn't a subject in that study, because they did a critical power test before, and they rode for 2 hours, and then they did a critical power. And by the way, a critical power test is 2 max. Like you literally fall off the bike when you're done. And so that's pretty crazy for a subject. But they got plenty of people to do it, and we got plenty of people to do it. And we found that you get about an 8% drop in that critical power level after you've exercised in the heavy intensity domain for 2 hours. And so one of the biggest learnings from this study is that this critical intensity or critical power is a dynamic value. It doesn't stay the same. And so at any time, the environment can impact it. At any time, if you're running up a hill or running down a hill, it changes. It's a very dynamic value. It's not as concrete and as steady as it was once thought to be. So still doing some exploratory work, and this was really, really important and cool to be involved in this work. How we thought about extending this critical power concept, though, was you can't really measure these values in real time. So you can tell somebody, here's when we think you're going to fatigue, or here's what your best possible time is going to be. But like I said, it's a dynamic value. So you have to be able to understand how that's changing in real time. So we did some work where we're using devices and using some physiological monitoring to be able to predict how critical power, or predict fatigue and predict performance time in real time. So tell you, like, you're gonna stop exercising in 10 minutes if you continue at this speed. That's what we were going for. So it turns out that muscle oxygenation can give us some pretty important insights, or some pretty cool insights into delineating these intensity domains. You see that if you're above critical power by a long ways, your muscle oxygenation just goes to the floor and you stop, where you get steady state values if you're below critical power. And so we were able to develop models where we used that muscle oxygenation value, and we did it during that 2 hours of exercise. So after they were fatigued, we were still able to predict pretty accurately when this person was going to stop. And so extending some of the work that has been, a lot of work that actually has been done on this critical power concept, to be able to tell people in real time, this is how hard you can go to finish this race in the time you want to, or if you continue going at this pace, you will not finish the race, kind of information. So giving people in real time what their performance was going to be. That was one of the purviews of the lab. So that was some really cool work. And then another bit of work that some of you have probably heard about is really looking at what are the limitations that humans have to exercise. What are our limitations as humans to perform? So I was, as it was mentioned, I was lucky enough to be involved in Nike's Breaking 2 attempt. So Nike's quest to break the 2-hour marathon, and it was an amazing experience to be involved in this. And a lot of people, and my colleague and I, Brett Kirby, were the primary scientists at Nike involved in this. And a lot of times people would ask us, like, how did you guys get tapped to do this? Like, this one of the biggest things that Nike's ever done, including our CEO believes that this was one of the biggest things, if not the biggest thing that Nike has ever done. How did we get tapped on the shoulder to be able to do this? And the truth is we didn't. And the truth is we took it. We came in with, I was involved in some of those early meetings, and we came in and said, here's our plan. If you guys want to do this, this is how we would do it. And they said, okay. And we said, okay. There was some scary moments, like, oh crap, like we actually have to do this now. But from a platform perspective, it wasn't letting somebody else define what it was going to be. It was us going in there and saying, this is how we would do it. This is how it can be done. And we were given that opportunity to do it. So for those of you who may be less familiar with what Breaking 2 is all about, I do have a short video. Nike always like to play videos.
It's not the absolute numbers that matter. It's picking the goal that you think is impossible. It was just like the 4-minute mile. Well, why should it matter? Humans have 10 fingers, they like even multiples. That's probably part of this.
I guess all of these records are arbitrary in a sense. It's just because they become the next step in our sort of sporting heritage and development.
And I think that's where the 2-hour thing comes from. Why shouldn't we be able to do this?
58, 59, 60, 61, 62, 63.
If
human body can do sub 2 hours, I think it was the greatest moment in athletics.
I can't believe that. Okay, 1 minute till the start.
When you plot out world records, it should take a couple decades to get to where we want to be. But no one's ever gone flat out from the gun before. That's what I think is so amazing about this project, is we're going to tell these guys, you're going to go for it from the gun, and whatever happens, happens. And that, I feel, is a recipe for greatness.
And 100% confident in the science. 100% confident this is mathematically possible and humans can do this. If it was easy, it'd be done.
There's no hiding from the clock. We're going to send you a long way, about as long and as hard as we think is physiologically possible. And we're going to see if you can do it or not.
About human endeavour. Why would you try to climb Everest? Why would you try to go to the moon? It's about the journey. It's about learning what our capabilities are.
So yeah, one of the things of working at Nike is you get used to cool videos. Nike does do cool videos. But this truly, for us and for Nike at its core, was about exploring the limits of human potential. It wasn't about running the fastest marathon. It was about how could you run 42.195 kilometers, 26.2 miles in 1 hour, 59 minutes, and 59 seconds. Can a human accomplish that? And when you clarify those rules, or when you clarify that purpose, it's very freeing, because you go after this. You go after exploring the limits of human potential, or the limits of human performance. You don't have to do it in the constraints of a marathon. We were criticized as an organization for breaking some rules during this attempt. And we didn't follow every marathon rule, because some of those marathon rules limit human performance. They limit our ability to show our true potential. And so we kind of tried to get rid of those barriers to human potential. And so it really was about exploring what a human is capable of doing. And it was the pursuit of a very specific, well-defined, singular outcome. And that, again, it can be and is very freeing when you say 42.195 kilometers in 1:59.59. That's the goal. Nothing else is the goal. That allows you to focus all your efforts on the problems that need to be solved specifically for that. It gets rid of a lot of bureaucracy, it gets rid of a lot of second guessing, it gets rid of a lot of overthinking. And so this pursuit of, or this quest for a specific well-defined outcome is you should think about that as you think about your goals in your career, trying to define them as well as possible, because it allows you to really go after them very clearly. Another thing that this was it was an inspired and passionate team, a small inspired and passionate team. It was business strategy, it was creative problem solving, it was product interventions, and it was science, and it was a different way of thinking, all directed towards a very clear purpose. And so when you take an organization like Nike that has all of these components, and you think about them and you approach and you apply them all towards a very clear purpose, it can be very powerful. From a scientific perspective, our approach was relatively simple. Pulling it off turns out to be hard, but our approach was relatively simple. What we did was we tried to identify the physiological potential of athletes. Who is capable of doing this mathematically? You can do that by understanding what somebody's VO2 max is, by understanding what's the sustainable percent of that VO2 max that they can sustain for a very long period of time. This critical power concept comes to mind. And then what is their running economy? How much energy is required for them to run at those speeds? Which is a 4:34-minute mile, by the way. And so that's a lot of energy to be able to run at those speeds. Just for reference, it's 68-second quarters done 105.5 times. And so that's very fast. I can't run a 68-second quarter, probably. Maybe if I tried really hard, I might be able to. But so that's what we did. We identified what's the physiological potential that is out there. And we identified 3 athletes that we felt had the physiology to be able to run at those speeds for that period of time. And then all we did was we removed barriers. What are the barriers that are in the way right now of a human being able to do this? Okay, when you remove barriers, we looked at it as we uncovered the true potential that we identified in these athletes. So things like energy demand of a marathon. Turns out when you turn a corner at the same speed, you're consuming a lot more energy to run at that speed. So let's get rid of a bunch of corners. Let's make these wide sweeping turns. Let's make it really flat. And let's maybe put a bunch of runners in front of them to block wind resistance. So that the energy required to overcome wind resistance is either significantly decreased or gone. Footwear, interventions. Can we reduce the amount of energy that's lost every time the foot hits the ground? If we can, we might be able to increase the speed at which they can run at the same level of energy. The impact of environment is a big one. It's one that you can't control when a race is scheduled on a single day in September or in Berlin or in the spring in London. You can't control these things. We tried to control it as much as possible. Pick a location and pick a time where the temperature was optimal for them to lose the amount of heat that they were producing when they were running at these speeds. And then hydration and nutrition. It turns out that elite marathoners are horrible at their own hydration and nutrition. I know of runners, one of them that was involved in our study, that has run a 2:09 marathon in the past without drinking or eating anything for the entire race. And we know that you can do that in a half marathon. You can't do that in a full marathon. And it's just, you will not run your best marathon. And so, and he did a 2:09. So what is his best marathon? Anyway, so we did a lot of work on removing barriers around hydration and nutrition. So that's really all we did. We identified physiological potential, and then we removed the things that will limit that potential as much as we could. Great leaps forward will not happen without great risk. This is true in life, it's true in business, and it was true in breaking too. On paper, Eliud Kipchoge ran a 2:02.25 for a marathon distance. It was an official marathon distance. It was just not a sanctioned world record. Because we broke a couple of rules, and the rules that we broke was we had pacers running in front of them that moved in and out during the race. And if a rule of a marathon is that if you can't enter a race after it starts. You can start the race and leave, but you cannot enter a race after it starts. So we were having pacers enter at certain intervals to make sure that they could, because finding somebody that can run 4:34 for that long turns out to be super hard to do. Not even being able to find somebody that can run a half marathon at that speed. Like we're talking a 60-minute half marathon, a 59-minute half marathon. There's not a lot of people in the world that can do that. So finding pacers that could run at that speed. So that's one of the rules we broke. Another one was you cannot run alongside an athlete who's running and hand them water. They have to pick it off the table. Somebody that's in the race can pick it off the table and then hand it to the runner, but they can't get it from somebody running alongside them. So I think that's kind of a stupid rule, but that was a rule that we broke. And the third one was we had a pace. We had them set at a pace that they had to try to maintain. So we did not, we asked them not to self-pace. We wanted them to pace. And so that was the third rule. You can't have any external pacing in a marathon. So those are really the only 3 rules that we didn't follow, and that made it not a sanctioned marathon, a sanctioned world record eligible marathon. It was a sanctioned marathon. It was run in Monza, Italy, and the Italian branch of the IAAF sanctioned the race. So it was an official sanctioned marathon. It just was not a world record eligible marathon. Boston is not a world record eligible marathon, so everybody knows. There's too much downhill. And there's plenty of other marathons out there that aren't world record eligible. So it was a true marathon. At the time, it was 2 minutes, 32 seconds faster than the world record at the time. The world record at the time was 2:02.57. So we were only 26 seconds away from being successful. But I don't think anybody who understands running or anybody who was involved in this project would look at this as a failure. This was a pretty amazing event, a pretty amazing accomplishment that Elliot did. And people give us a little bit of credit for it. I cannot run 4:34. Elliot did this. All we did was we removed as many barriers as possible so that he could accomplish what he was capable of doing. But this story doesn't really end for Elliot on May 6th in 2017. This is a picture of Elliot right before the Berlin Marathon last September. Elliot is like the Buddha to me. He's a very amazing person. He throws out quotes like this, like he's eating breakfast. He's constantly throwing out these things that are amazing. He's a very incredible person. But he had 2 other attempts at a world record marathon between breaking 2 and this day. One in Berlin, he ran a 2:03:30-ish, I think, and it was terrible weather. We were there. It was raining. It was terrible weather the whole day. Still runs a 2:03:30. He also ran a 2:04 and change in London last spring. But on this day, he ran a 2:01:39, which breaks the world record by a minute and something. Minute and change, minute and 20-something seconds. So, and the team that I started at Nike continued to work with him throughout this, and still Brett's in Kenya actually right now, and continue to work with him today. And talking with Brett after this happened, he was in better shape here than he was during Breaking 2. If you look at all the models and everything that we've created for him, he was in better shape than when he ran Breaking 2. So Brett firmly believes that if we were to do Breaking 2 on that day, that he would have gone under 2 hours, which is easy to believe when you look at what he's done. So, an incredible athlete, and it's all him. So this kind of summarizes what I consider to be important components of my body of work. And this apparently winding path really all connects to pushing boundaries and exploring human limits. Even if some of them are more tightly connected, like Breaking 2 was more tightly connected to that purpose than, say, some of the work I did here at Mayo as far as specific work goes, but it's all connected. Everything that I've learned along the way is all connected to this purpose. So this is my through line. This is the thing that connects all the work and the impact that work has had on my career and my purpose moving forward. So where am I going from here? I created and started a company called West 124 Degrees, and that at its core is really me pushing my own limits. It's me really going out there on my own and saying, what am I capable of doing from both of a body of work standpoint and creating a business. So at its core, it is about pushing limits and pushing boundaries. So it's all about your purpose and the platform that you have. So find your purpose, understand what it is that you're passionate about, what connects your work, and what really pisses you off about what other people are doing in your industry and in your work. Define the rules for your work. Define those for yourself, because if you don't, somebody else will. If you do not define the rules that you work by, somebody else will define those rules for you. They will define that work for you. I see it happen all the time, at Nike especially. People come in, and they're super excited about having a job at Nike, and they wait for people to tell them what to do. And people will tell them what to do. And then 2 years later, they're frustrated that they don't get to do the work that they want to do. Well, you can define your own rules, and you can find a way to get that work done, no matter your platform. So create that platform. Use that platform to be able to help you define those rules. You won't be able to do this without help. Science is not done in a vacuum. Any career that you have is not done in a vacuum. So you will not be able to do this without help. I was lucky enough to have a tremendous number of people, many of them in this room today, that have helped me create this body of work. That I actually started writing out slides with all their names on it, and it ended up like 5 slides. So I narrowed it down to these 5 people that have had significant impacts on my life and my work at important times. So obviously Chris and John here, Dr. Michael Joyner at Mayo Clinic had a big impact on how I think about performance. Dr. Brett Kirby, involved in Breaking Two, tremendous colleague, and the late Sandy Bodecker. Who, I don't know if anybody knows of Sandy, but at Nike, he was a legend, and he really impacted my life the last few years I was there. My wonderful wife. Excuse me. Supportive family is very important, especially when you go to that family member and say, hey, I'm going to leave my job. It's pretty well high paying, and I've been pretty successful at it. So how does that sound? So the support of family is very important. So the world really needs good scientists. Desperately today, the world really needs good scientists in every facet of society, in every corner of society. Whether that's business, or that's government, or that's nonprofit, or if it's academia. The world needs you to create an impactful body of work. So I hope you can see that it's when people ask me, how did you get your job? It's almost impossible for me to say, this is how you should go, this is the path you should take. Because even if you had my job at Nike or anywhere else, you should not and would not be doing the same work. You should be doing your work. You should be creating your own body of work in that position, even if it was the same position. So use that platform and think about it that way. That body of work that gets you out of bed every morning and helps you define your own rules. That's all I have, so thank you very much for listening. I always like to end on this quote as well, another classic Buddha L.A. Kipchoge quote.
Yeah, we have time for some questions and answers with Dr. Wilkins.
Yeah.
Dr. Wilkins, I really enjoyed your talk, thank you. I had a question about your choice in athletes for the Breaking Two project. How many athletes did you start out with, and then how did Elliot kind of rise to the cream of the crop?
Yeah, so we tested around 18 to 20 athletes. So that the athlete pool that we had to choose from was about that. We're looking in that pool. Because this was a Nike project, we tested Nike athletes, so there wasn't a lot of access to athletes that were sponsored by others. So that was one of the criticisms of why weren't some of these other athletes that might be able to do it. So we ended up with those three athletes, with Lilisa DeCisa, Xerxes Esse, and Elliot Kipchoge, based primarily on their physiology, but also on their attitude and how they approach this problem, and their willingness to work with us as a team. So when I say inspired team, it was the athletes, it was their coaches, it was all the pacers. Everybody was super engaged and super passionate about this project. And so those three athletes, their attitude had just as much to do with why we chose them as their physiology. I like to give an example of Xerxes Esse. One time we had him in the lab, and we were doing some running economy studies on him, or tests on him. And we wanted to see, it was early on in his training, but we wanted to see, what would his VO2 be at 21.1 kilometers an hour, which is 13.1 miles an hour. And so we asked him, would you be willing to run on a treadmill at this speed? And again, it was early on in his training, so we didn't really know what to expect. But his response was, how long? It was, some other athletes would be like, I don't know, my hammy's kind of sore. But, his right away, his response was, how long do you want to run for? So that kind of attitude, and I think that kind of attitude is what helped Elliot rise to the top. Is that Elliot's approach to running and Elliot's philosophy around his career and around his life is, like I say, special. He throws stuff out like this, right? And so I think that's one of the reasons why he rose to the top. He's an exceptional human being, both physiologically and just mentally in the way that he thinks about the world. So I think that's a lot of the reason. And people say now too, okay, 2 hours 25, we've kind of proven that it's possible. It's still not been done, but and so now how long will it really take for somebody to do it? I hope that the Elliott Kipchoge's can show the next generation that it is possible. And you have actually seen a lot of times drop precipitously since Breaking 2. So I think that the world has seen that it's possible. But it's going to take. The reason I'm a little, maybe even more skeptical now than I was before is because it's going to take someone like Elliott Kipchoge, and I think he's rare. And so finding somebody like him again, I think they're out there. The Elliott Kipchoges of the world are out there, but it might take a little longer just to find that person again because he is special. That didn't really answer your question, but otherwise I don't know why he was able to do it. His confidence and his ability to just push himself and just be in the moment and run as fast as he can for as long as he can is super special. Yeah.
Hi, Brad.
Hey.
Once you identify Kipchoge as maybe the main guy.
And just to clarify, at the start line, we didn't say Elliott Kipchoge's the guy. Like all three of them.
Yeah, you had a handful of guys.
Yeah.
I think people kind of knew he was in the forefront. Did you, from the time you identified him to the time you got to the starting line, do you make any suggestions on how him and his coach may change the training?
So we were running mathematical models, training models, and things like that the whole time. So they were sending us data weekly, and we were running those 2 models. The other 2 we made more suggestions to. It turns out when you put Elliott's training data into the models, he was doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing. Like so, there really wasn't a lot of things that we could point to Elliott. Elliott's coach and him have a relationship where his coach knows him so well and knows how he's responding to the training loads that he's put on, and that they can adjust things quite uniquely in the world of running. So he was doing everything from a dose response relationship that he should have been doing. So with Elliott, we really didn't do anything different, or didn't suggest anything different. And we really didn't want this to be, Nike coming in and telling them how to do it. That's why we built these relationships with them, and it was important that we have this relationship. So we had the relationships with the other guys, and we were able to say, like, for example, Lisa DeCisa can run forever at a certain speed, and very fast, like just not quite 4:34, but he can run forever at that speed. Like he'll run for 4 hours at that speed, but he can't really run faster than that speed. So we wanted him to do more intervals and things like that, where he was really trying to train his speed to be able to run faster. Where Dursane Vese, on the other hand, can run super fast for a half marathon, but he has trouble sustaining that for a full marathon. Like he at the time he had the world record and the second fastest time in the half marathon. But so we wanted him to work more on sustaining, doing more long distance kind of stuff. So, but Elliott was doing it all pretty much perfectly if you listen to the models. So the answer is no. We didn't really tell Elliott what to do. And yeah, Elliott taught us more than we taught him. Yeah.
So that was a very inspiring talk, and I'm glad that all the students could hear it. Of course, it makes me question some of my life choices. But I'm just curious, you talk a lot about performance and pushing the envelope, and that's great. I'm wondering if that bumped into issues related to marketing and profit, right? Like you could spend all the time developing this thing, and then it turns out the thing that sells it is the color of the shoe, right? Yeah. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the...
Well, there might be a reason I'm not at I'm kidding. Yes, it is, and that's why I tried to approach this from how do I integrate science with business and innovation and the thinking around strategy. I didn't try to come in and say it's all about the science, because I know that the color of the shoe, honestly, the color of the shoe, and there's been studies, sells more shoes than the properties from a performance standpoint. So that's known. It's unfortunate as a scientist to know that, but so you have to, it's all an integrated problem. And so you hope that the impact that you can have on your science is enough to affect the person who's buying those shoes and help them be better at the end of the day. And that's really what you're trying to do. But you also know that just like in academic science, you do a great study, if it's not published, nobody's going to know about it. So you have to work with that whole environment. So you do a great study and you work on these interventions and they work and you know it. If that doesn't hit the market and that isn't bought by anybody, nobody's going to know it. And so you take it, I took it from the same perspective of I have to play this game and I have to understand this so that my work can get out there in the world. And so that's really how I try to think about it.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I guess I have two questions. So one was, how do you think the Breaking 2 project affected Kipchoge's psyche and his confidence going into his world record attempts following the project? Like how did it affect his psyche? And also, how do you think the project affects the progression of elite distance running long term, knowing that it has been done now?
Yeah, go close. So the first question, so there's no way that Breaking 2 did not impact his world record attempt. Not because just psychologically, he knew he could do it. And so he knew he could run that fast. And so in the right situation, the right conditions, it turns out the weather on that day were great. The wind on that day, the team had modeled out all of that, what the wind was going to do, and they gave him suggestions on where he could push it and where he may not want to. So his confidence going in could not be not impacted, to do a lot of double negatives, by Breaking 2. Another way I think it is super important is every day in training. When he shows up that day in training, he knows that he can do it. So in training, he pushes himself more, which means that he has a bigger physiological response or a bigger load on that day that he can then adapt to be prepared for that world record. So it's not just the race that impacted it. I firmly believe that it was every day in training where he now knows he can run that fast for that long, that allowed him to push his training that much harder and adapt to a greater stress. So there's no way to tease it out. As far as your second question goes, so like I said, you have seen general average times, especially of the elite and sub-elite runners, decrease quite a bit since Breaking 2. So I think that it has impacted the way people are approaching races. We have stories. The team went to China a few months after Breaking 2, and there was some groups there that were starting to run marathons as teams and incorporating the pacing strategies that we did as a team. And so it's kind of changed how people think about running marathons. I think team marathons is a great idea because you can start to treat it like the Tour de France. Treat it like a cycling race where you're drafting and changing. And if you start, people start thinking about how to run a marathon differently and be innovative around the way that they think about running a marathon, I think you'll see times start to drop even more. Problem is you can't find people that can run with the likes of Elliott for that long. And so how do you build that into these world record times? But I do think it'll be interesting to see what the next generation is. These guys that are training with Elliott right now, or training in some of these other camps right now, that now have seen that this is on the precipice of being able to happen. That's going to make them train harder and get bigger training loads and bigger adaptations to their training every day. And so I think it'll be interesting. Jeffrey Kimura is one to watch. If those of you interested in endurance running would know that name. He has the potential to. He trains with Elliott. He has the potential to really push that envelope. And there's a few others like him that have that potential. So I do feel like we've collectively, the Breaking 2 team and doing Breaking 2 has decreased the amount of time it's going to take to get to a sub-2-hour marathon. Again, going back to my first point, it's going to take a special person like Elliott, so that might be a limiting factor, but I do think it definitely impacted that timeline.
So, once again, great show our appreciation to Dr. Wilkins for coming down. Being selected as one of the distinguished alumni speakers by the graduate school, one of 3 this year, and got a small token of our appreciation.
Thank you very much.
And for the graduate students if you have a little bit of time, we have a coffee and a reception area for Brad over in Lillis 175, so down the floor at the end of the building. Otherwise, thank you all for coming out for this event.
Thank you.